For 500 years, history has laughed at one of Henry VIII's wives. They called her ugly, they called her lucky, they called her the one who escaped. But the truth is far more unsettling. Henry VIII didn't reject Anne of Cleves because he found her unattractive. He rejected her because she wounded him. And powerful men don't forgive that. By the end of this story, you'll understand why Anne survived when nearly every other queen around her was destroyed, and why her so-called happy ending may be the most disturbing fate of them all. They called her the Mare of Flanders, a joke passed between men who believed themselves clever, who thought cruelty wore well beneath velvet and ermine. Anne of Cleves never reacted, not because the insult didn't wound, but because she didn't understand the language yet. Her sentence in England had already begun, long before she ever learned the words. January 1540. The Thames runs thick and black beneath winter skies. Somewhere inside the veiled barges cutting through its surface, a woman is traveling toward a future she did not choose, toward a man she has never seen, toward a role that will nearly erase her from history. This is not a romance. This is not even a tragic misunderstanding. This is the story of what happens when a king feels humiliated and decides to rewrite reality so that he never has to feel that way again. And Anne of Cleves will be the one made to pay for it. The year is 1539, and Henry VIII is hunting. Not for deer or boar, those pursuits have grown dull for a man whose appetites have consumed 3 wives and counting. No, the King of England hunts for something more elusive, political advantage wrapped in the body of a foreign princess. Someone useful, someone disposable. Thomas Cromwell understands this better than anyone. The king's chief minister has survived in Henry's court by reading the spaces between words, by anticipating desires before they're fully formed. And right now, Henry desires an alliance with the German Protestant princes. The Pope has excommunicated him. Catholic Europe wants him dead. He needs friends, and friends in the 16th century come with dowries and marriage contracts. Cromwell's agents scour the courts of Europe. They need a bride who is Protestant, politically connected, and this matters more than anyone will admit, beautiful enough to satisfy a king whose ego has swollen to match his waistline. They find Anne, daughter of the Duke of Cleves, sister to one of the most powerful princes in the fragmented German states. The negotiations begin in rooms where women are never present, where their lives are bargained over like bolts of cloth or barrels of wine. Anne's brother wants English support. Henry wants German alliances. Nobody asks Anne what she wants, because what Anne wants has never mattered and will never matter in this transaction. But Henry, for all his power, cannot marry a woman he hasn't seen. So he sends Hans Holbein, his court painter, to Cleves. "Paint her," he commands. "Show me what I'm getting." Here is where the story begins to curdle. Holbein paints what he sees, a young woman with a long face, intelligent eyes, dressed in the elaborate German fashion that will later be used against her. The portrait arrives in England, and Henry is pleased. He calls her beautiful. He boasts to his court about his new bride. He writes letters filled with anticipation. But portraits lie, or rather, portraits tell only the truth their subjects and painters choose to reveal. And Henry has built his entire existence on a foundation of chosen truths, convenient fictions, and the divine right to rewrite reality according to his needs. When Anne arrives in England on that frozen January day, she steps into a trap that has been decades in the making. Not a trap meant specifically for her, she's simply the latest woman to stumble into machinery designed to consume royal wives and spit out either sons or scandals. Think about what England has become by 1540. This is a country that has torn itself from Rome, dissolved centuries-old monasteries, and executed anyone who questioned the king's supremacy. This is a nation soaked in the blood of Thomas More, John Fisher, and thousands of monks and nuns whose only crime was loyalty to a church that existed before Henry decided he was its head. Anne Boleyn's head rotted on a spike because she couldn't produce a son. Catherine of Aragon died alone and broken because she couldn't accept being discarded. Jane Seymour survived by dying in childbirth before Henry could tire of her. Anne of Cleves arrives knowing none of this history. Her English is poor, her understanding of English politics is minimal. She's been raised in a provincial court where modesty is valued, where women are taught to be pious and practical, not sophisticated courtesans trained in the art of pleasing volatile kings. The meeting happens in Rochester. Henry, in a moment of romantic delusion, decides to surprise his bride-to-be. He disguises himself this bloated, ulcerated man who can barely walk without assistance and bursts into Anne's chambers, expecting her to recognize her true love despite the costume. It's the fantasy of a man who has confused power with charm, who genuinely believes that kingship makes him irresistible. Anne doesn't recognize him. She's polite, but bewildered by this strange, poorly dressed man interrupting her rest. She doesn't swoon. She doesn't gasp with delight when he reveals himself. She simply doesn't react the way Henry expected. And that, more than anything, seals her fate. Because Henry's ego cannot survive indifference. He has restructured an entire religion to satisfy his desires. He has killed wives and counselors and clergy to maintain his vision of himself as chosen by God, irresistible to women, master of all he surveys. And this German woman, who speaks broken English and dresses in unfamiliar clothes, has failed to worship at the altar of his magnificence. The wedding happens anyway, 4 days later. Power has its own momentum, contracts have been signed, alliances announced. Henry walks Anne down the aisle at Greenwich Palace, wearing the expression of a man approaching his execution. And perhaps, in his twisted psychology, he believes that's exactly what this is, his martyrdom, his suffering for England. The wedding night becomes legend, but legends rarely tell the truth. What we know comes from Henry's own testimony, given later to justify the annulment. He claims he couldn't consummate the marriage. He blames Anne's body, her smell, her breasts that hung like empty sacks, his words, recorded by men who wrote them down without question, because questioning a king's sexual complaints about his wife could cost you your head. But here's what those recordings don't capture: the terror of a 24-year-old woman lying in a bed with a diseased, aging king who has already executed one wife and discarded another. The humiliation of having your body discussed in council chambers by men who treat female anatomy like a subject for agricultural inspection. The isolation of being trapped in a foreign country where you can barely speak the language, married to a man who has already decided you're repulsive. Henry tells his doctors he feels no desire for her. He confides to Cromwell that he's certain Anne isn't a virgin, despite all evidence to the contrary. He complains that his member won't rise, but somehow this failure, this impotence from a man ravaged by syphilis and obesity becomes Anne's fault. She's ugly. She's not stimulating enough. She doesn't know how to please a man. The machinery of annulment begins to turn before the marriage is even a month old. But here's where the story you've been told starts to crack open. Because if this was simply about an unattractive bride and a disappointed groom, why the elaborate deception? Why the careful political maneuvering? Why does Cromwell, the man who arranged this marriage, end up on the scaffold, accused of treason for binding the king to this Flanders mare? The truth is darker than vanity. The truth is about power, control, and what happens when a woman fails to be useful in the one way that matters in Tudor England, by providing sons. Anne can't provide sons if the marriage isn't consummated. And the marriage isn't consummated because Henry can't or won't perform. But admitting impotence would shatter his carefully constructed image, so Anne becomes the problem. Anne's body becomes defective. Anne's foreignness, her German fashion, her inability to read Henry's moods and anticipate his desires. All of this becomes evidence of her unsuitability. The annulment proceedings would be laughable if they weren't so vicious. Anne is interrogated about her previous betrothal to Francis of Lorraine, a contract made when she was a child and dissolved years before. The same men who arranged her marriage to Henry now testify that perhaps it wasn't valid, that perhaps she was still technically promised to Francis, that perhaps this whole marriage was a mistake from the start. Anne is given a choice that isn't a choice: agree to the annulment or end up like Anne Boleyn. Sign the papers acknowledging the marriage was never valid, or discover what Tower Green looks like at dawn. Accept the story we're writing about you, or we'll write a different story, one that ends with your head separated from your body. What would you do? Before you answer, remember, you're alone in a foreign country. You barely speak the language. Your brother is hundreds of miles away and won't risk war with England over your fate. The man who holds your life in his hands has already killed one wife and will kill another in just 2 years. Every noble in England is watching to see which way you'll bend, and your survival depends on bending correctly. On the 9th of July, 1540, Anne of Cleves agrees that her marriage to Henry VIII was never valid. She signs documents stating she never truly became his wife, never became Queen of England, never shared his bed in any meaningful way. She erases herself from history in exchange for her life, and history calls this mercy. They gave her Richmond Palace and Hever Castle. They gave her an income of £4,000 a year, making her one of the wealthiest women in England. They gave her the title of the king's beloved sister, a phrase so saturated with irony it could drown nations. And they told her to be grateful. Anne was grateful, or at least she performed gratitude with the skill of a woman who understood that survival required becoming whatever her observers needed her to be. She attended court functions when summoned. She smiled at Henry's new wife, Catherine Howard, a teenager who would be dead within 2 years. She accepted gifts from the king and sent him proper thanks. She became the model of compliant, cheerful acceptance. And everyone called it a happy ending. But examine this happiness more closely. Look at what Anne actually received in exchange for erasing her own existence. Yes, she kept her head, an achievement that cannot be underestimated in Henry's England. Yes, she gained financial security that most women of her era could only dream of. But what did she lose? She lost her identity as a wife, which in the 16th century was the only identity that gave women legitimate status. She lost her chance for children, which was not just a personal loss, but a loss of purpose in a world that defined women through their wombs. She lost her connection to her homeland. Returning to Cleves would mean admitting that England had rejected her, returning as damaged goods in a political market that valued women by their marriageability. Most devastatingly, she lost the ability to write her own story. Every account of Anne of Cleves that survives comes filtered through the lens of her rejection. She becomes a footnote in Henry's biography, the lucky wife who escaped, the ugly duckling who was never a swan but at least didn't get beheaded. Her intelligence, her adaptability, her courage, none of these qualities matter in a narrative obsessed with whether she pleased a king. The English court watched her capitulation with relief. Here, finally, was a woman who understood her place, not like Catherine of Aragon, who fought her annulment for 6 years and died still claiming to be England's true queen. Not like Anne Boleyn, who went to her execution maintaining her innocence and her dignity. Anne of Cleves bent. She broke. She became whatever they needed her to be. Except she didn't break. That's the part they missed. That's the part that makes this story something other than a simple tale of humiliation and compliance. Anne of Cleves committed an act of subversive genius. She survived. In an era when royal wives were disposable commodities, when women's bodies were battlegrounds for dynastic ambitions, when refusal meant death, Anne found a third option. She didn't fight. She didn't martyr herself. She simply outlived them all. Henry VIII died in 1547, a diseased, paranoid wreck of a man. Anne attended his funeral as the king's beloved sister and inherited even more wealth from his will. Catherine Howard, the pretty young wife who replaced her, was beheaded in 1542 for adultery. Real or fabricated, it hardly mattered. Catherine Parr, the sixth wife, survived Henry but died in childbirth a year later. Anne lived until 1557, watching three of Henry's children take the throne in succession, outlasting nearly everyone who had orchestrated her humiliation. Think about what that survival required. Not just physical survival, the absence of execution, but psychological survival, in a court that had declared her repulsive. She had to attend celebrations where people who had witnessed her rejection pretended nothing had happened. She had to watch Henry parade newer, younger wives while maintaining her role as the grateful sister. She had to internalize the narrative of her own inadequacy while simultaneously performing contentment with her fate. The English loved her for this. They created a myth around her, the clever foreign princess who understood that being Henry's sister was better than being his wife. They praised her accommodation, her flexibility, her good sense. They turned her trauma into a fairy tale where the rejected bride gets a happy ending through submission. But this fairy tale was written by people who benefited from her silence, the men who had testified against her marriage, who had discussed her body in legal proceedings, who had reduced her to a collection of inadequate parts. They all praised her good nature afterward. Of course they did. Her compliance validated their actions. Her apparent happiness erased their guilt. The church that had annulled her marriage on spurious grounds celebrated her piety. The court that had mocked her as the Flanders mare welcomed her at functions and remarked on how well she had adjusted. Everyone participated in a collective fiction that what happened to Anne was somehow for the best, that she was actually lucky, that 6 months of marriage to a diseased tyrant, followed by a lifetime of imposed celibacy and social ambiguity, was a blessing in disguise. And perhaps, in the calculus of Tudor survival, it was. Perhaps choosing life over dignity, wealth over status, survival over martyrdom was the most radical choice available to a powerless woman in a lethal court. Perhaps Anne of Cleves was a genius of adaptation, a master strategist who played a long game that none of her contemporary observers understood. Or perhaps she simply had no choice at all. And we've spent 5 centuries mistaking captivity for contentment because it makes us feel better about what was done to her. Consider the women who came after her, who weren't granted the option of becoming the king's beloved sister. Catherine Howard was a teenager when she married Henry, barely educated, manipulated by her family into a marriage that would destroy her. When accusations of adultery surfaced, whether true or manufactured, she wasn't offered Richmond Palace and a comfortable income. She was dragged to the block and beheaded before her 20th birthday. Did Catherine Howard think about Anne of Cleves in her final days? Did she wonder what she might have done differently to earn the mercy of annulment rather than the justice of the axe? Did she understand that the difference between survival and execution often had nothing to do with guilt or innocence, but everything to do with political timing and the king's particular mood? And what about the men who enabled this system? Thomas Cromwell, who orchestrated Anne's marriage, was executed less than 3 weeks after her annulment was finalized. His crime? Treason, officially. In reality, he had outlived his usefulness and made the mistake of binding Henry to a wife the king didn't want. His head joined the collection on London Bridge, a reminder that even men weren't safe if they failed to anticipate the king's desires. The doctors who testified about Anne's body, who discussed her physical inadequacies in legal proceedings, they kept their positions. The nobles who witnessed the annulment and nodded along with Henry's complaints, they were rewarded with confiscated monastery lands. The clergy who declared the marriage invalid despite performing it 6 months earlier, they maintained their benefices and their influence. Everyone who participated in Anne's humiliation prospered as long as they told the story the king wanted to hear. That's how institutional cruelty works. It doesn't require monsters. It just requires ordinary people willing to prioritize their comfort over someone else's dignity, their safety over another's truth. Anne lived 17 years past Henry's death, through Edward VI's brief reign, through Mary VI's bloody restoration of Catholicism, into the early years of Elizabeth I's rule. She watched England convulse through religious upheaval, political intrigue, and the deaths of thousands. She attended coronations and funerals. She managed her estates. She lived quietly, diplomatically, carefully, and she never married again. Not because she was forbidden as the king's sister, she had more autonomy than most women. Not because she was too old, she was only 34 when Henry died. She never married again because marriage, for Anne of Cleves, had meant the destruction of her identity, the public discussion of her body as defective, and the very real threat of death if she failed to play her role correctly. So, she chose a different role. She chose to be the woman who survived. And if that survival required silence, if it required performing contentment with her marginalization, if it required watching other women walk into the same trap that had nearly consumed her, well, what else could she have done? That's not a rhetorical question. That's the question at the heart of Anne of Cleves' story, and it doesn't have a comfortable answer. The final portrait of Anne of Cleves hangs in St. John's College, Oxford. She's older in this painting, dressed in black, her face settled into an expression that could be serenity or resignation, or the careful blankness of someone who has learned not to reveal herself. Historians debate whether it's actually her. The attribution is uncertain, the provenance unclear. Even in death, even in paint, Anne's identity remains contested, uncertain, dependent on other people's interpretations. She died in July 1557 at Chelsea Old Manor, probably from cancer, definitely alone. No children gathered at her bedside. No husband held her hand. The king's beloved sister left this world much as she had lived the last 17 years of it, quietly, without fuss, without demanding the attention of history. Her will distributed her wealth among her servants and friends. She asked to be buried in Westminster Abbey, near the high altar, which was both a claim to status and a reminder that she had been, however briefly, however conditionally, a queen. They gave her a tomb, but not the one she requested. She was buried in the Abbey, yes, but in a modest grave that wouldn't be properly marked for centuries. Because even in death, Anne of Cleves couldn't be allowed to take up too much space, to make too bold a claim on historical memory. She had to remain the footnote, the anomaly, the lucky one who got away. But collapse happens slowly at first, then all at once. And the collapse Anne of Cleves represents isn't about one woman or one marriage or even one king. It's about an entire system built on the premise that women's bodies exist for male use, that female autonomy is negotiable, that survival requires erasing yourself so completely that even your victories look like defeats. The Tudor dynasty itself collapsed within 50 years of Henry's death. Elizabeth I, the daughter of the executed Anne Boleyn, chose never to marry, a decision that makes more sense when you understand what marriage meant for royal women in her lifetime. She watched her father destroy wives. She saw her sister Mary die, broken by her husband's indifference and her body's failure to produce an heir. She knew her cousin Jane Grey was executed partly for being married to the wrong man. And somewhere in Elizabeth's understanding of power and survival was the example of Anne of Cleves, who lived because she became nothing more threatening than a sister. Elizabeth created a different mythology around herself, the Virgin Queen, married to England, beyond the control of any husband or father. But her survival strategy echoed Anne's in crucial ways. Both women understood that in a world designed to consume female autonomy, the safest option might be refusing to play the game as designed. Yet what haunts me about Anne's story isn't her survival. It's what we've done with it. We've turned her capitulation into triumph, her marginalization into liberation, her silence into wisdom. We've created a narrative where being declared too repulsive to consummate a marriage becomes a stroke of luck, where losing your identity as a wife and potential mother becomes winning, where spending your life performing gratitude for not being murdered becomes a happy ending. This narrative serves a purpose. It makes us feel better about a system that gave women only two options: submit or die. If we can believe Anne was content, even happy, with her fate, Then we don't have to confront the cruelty of a world that gave her no real choices. We don't have to sit with the horror of a legal proceeding where grown men discussed whether a woman's breasts were sufficiently attractive to arouse their king. We don't have to acknowledge that the best-case scenario for a royal wife in Tudor England was being declared legally repulsive and exiled to comfortable obscurity. Think about the modern parallels. Think about every time a woman's worth is reduced to her physical attractiveness, every time a woman is blamed for a man's dysfunction, every time institutions close ranks to protect powerful men while sacrificing the women they've harmed. Think about how we still tell women that survival requires accommodation, that speaking truth is less important than maintaining peace, that your dignity is a fair price to pay for your safety. Anne of Cleves lived in the 16th century, but the machinery that processed her still operates. It's more subtle now, perhaps. We don't publicly discuss women's bodies in annulment proceedings, we do it on social media instead. We don't execute wives who fail to please their husbands, we just destroy their reputations, their careers, their sense of self. We don't force women to sign documents erasing their own marriages, we just make the alternative so terrifying that compliance seems like choice. The myth of Anne of Cleves tells us that accommodation works, that silence pays, that the way to survive a system designed to destroy you is to become so unthreatening that the system decides you're not worth destroying. And maybe, in individual cases, in specific moments of danger, that's true. Maybe Anne's choice was the only choice, and judging it from 5 centuries of distance is an act of breathtaking arrogance. But here's what the myth doesn't tell us. Anne of Cleves died without anyone knowing what she actually thought about what happened to her. Did she consider herself lucky? Did she resent every moment of her performed contentment? Did she lie awake at night in her palaces and castles, thinking about the children she never had, the love she never experienced, the life she might have lived if she'd been born into a different world? We don't know. We can't know. Because the price of her survival was her silence, and 500 years later we're still living with that silence, still filling it with our own interpretations, still using her story to tell ourselves whatever makes us most comfortable. The institutional cruelty that destroyed Anne's marriage and reconstructed her identity didn't end with Tudor England. It metastasized, it adapted. It learned to disguise itself as concern, as tradition, as the natural order of things. Every time a woman is told to be grateful for less than she deserves, every time accommodation is praised as wisdom and silence is rewarded as grace, that's the ghost of Anne of Cleves, still performing contentment, still surviving by becoming whatever the powerful need her to be. But maybe, and this is the thought that keeps me up at night, maybe Anne of Cleves wasn't performing at all. Maybe she genuinely found peace in her reduced life, genuine contentment in her palaces and her wealth and her carefully maintained position. Maybe survival itself, in a world designed to kill women like her, was enough. Maybe we're the ones projecting our own horror onto her story because we need her to be a victim to make sense of what was done to her. Or maybe she was both, genuinely content and genuinely compromised, truly grateful and truly trapped, really surviving and really dying inside all at once. Because humans contain multitudes even when history tries to reduce them to simple narratives. What remains certain is this. They called her the Mare of Flanders, laughed at her inadequacy, declared her body repulsive, erased her marriage, and told her to be grateful for her diminishment. And Anne of Cleves lived longer than all of them, outlasted every person who humiliated her, and was buried in Westminster Abbey while her tormentors rotted in unmarked graves or tombs that tourists walk past without noticing. If you subscribe now, you'll discover more stories of women who survived impossible systems through intelligence and adaptation, and you'll understand why their survival strategies still matter today. In the end, perhaps that's its own kind of victory, not the one we want for her, not the one she might have wanted for herself, but the one she earned by refusing to become another tragic footnote, another executed queen, another woman who chose dignity over survival and paid for it with her life. Anne of Cleves lived in a court where that itself was a radical act, where women's lives were cheaper than their usefulness, where queens were disposed of with the same casual cruelty as spoiled meat. She lived. She adapted. She survived. And if you're not subscribed yet, you're missing the deeper truths about how power operates, how survival requires compromises that history judges but rarely understands. Hit that subscribe button before you forget. She lived, and maybe, just maybe, that was enough. Or maybe it wasn't enough at all, and we've spent 5 centuries lying to ourselves about the happy ending of a woman who was given no choice but to erase herself or die. That's the dark truth behind Henry VIII's reject queen. Not that she was ugly or inadequate or unlucky, but that she was processed through a system designed to destroy women, and her survival required becoming complicit in her own diminishment. And we've been celebrating that complicity ever since, calling it wisdom, calling it luck, calling it anything but what it actually was, the best option in a world with no good options. Anne of Cleves died 468 years ago, but her ghost still whispers the same question to every woman facing impossible choices. What would you do? How far would you bend to survive? And when survival requires erasing yourself, does winning actually mean anything at all?